And in this episode, we're going to look at Romans 1 to 8. Absolutely immense chapter. Now, Tom, I think it's like confession almost, actually. For me, these are some of the hardest chapters in the New Testament. I know a lot of people would say Revelation. Maybe some people don't get on with John so well. But for me, I feel a little bit like I'm climbing around the Himalayas and slightly struggling to breathe. And there's kind of clause upon clause, and I have to work really, really hard. And then, of course, you're surrounded in Bible studies by guys who are like, Romans is my favourite letter. How can anybody not love it? And I've always felt a little bit like, this feels big. It's like, maybe when you're younger, you watch a classic film and you're like, I tell it's good, but hoping you can help me today.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure anyone can help you in this. But I think the thing about Romans is, of course, these chapters that we have, we use one of these each day, don't we, to get through the New Testament in a year. They weren't in what Paul wrote. And Romans, I think, is one of those ones that when you do a chapter on its own and then go away and then come back, it's really hard. And it is one of those ones that if you can just sit down and listen to it from beginning to end, or read it from beginning to end, you start to get it a bit more.
Yeah.
So that would be the thing, if you are really struggling with Romans. But I think one of the things that we also do is we bring our assumptions about what Christianity is into this. And when we find it hard, it could be a really helpful moment to say, let me just review some of the assumed answers I had to some of the really most fundamental questions there are about what it is to be a Christian.
Amazing.
And so that's what we're going to try and do today. Just some of these questions that we maybe never actually ask because it's kind of assumed. But let's ask them, because I think that makes a big difference to how we understand Romans.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to fire some of these questions at you, and we're going to use the text to see what we can get to. So one question would be, what's the point of being a Christian?
Yeah, isn't that an interesting question? What is the point of being a Christian? I wonder what answer you would give to that right now. Not why are you a Christian, but what is the point? Like, what does God want out of you as a Christian, if you want to put it that way?
Yeah.
And I think most of us will actually not be quite sure how to answer that.
Yeah.
I mean, anyway, this is how Paul answers it, which is really quite nice. Right at the beginning, he says this: Jesus Christ, our Lord, through him we received grace and apostleship. He's talking about himself, to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. So the point of being a Christian is that we would become people who obey Jesus. That Jesus' name would be glorified and honoured in all of the nations and all the world. That is the point. So the purpose, and if you read a little bit later in the introduction, he quotes a verse from Habakkuk, which I always quite like. If I'd been a little bit braver, I might have called one of my kids Habakkuk.
Habakkuk, yeah.
It's a good one,
isn't it?
So Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith. Or he actually, in Habakkuk it's the other way around. It's that by faith the righteous will live. But the idea is that the whole point of life made by God is that humans would do things right. Adam and Eve were made to do the right thing cut this plant back and name this animal and rule over dam the river and make it go here and extend the garden, cultivate the soil. That was the point. Yeah. Do things right and treat each other right. And the tragedy that Paul lays out is that people started not doing the right thing, or they started coming up with their own definition of what the right thing was. And the point of being a Christian is to come back to the agreement of, yeah, actually what you say is right, God, I'm going to do, and I'm going to live right in every circumstance, be righteous, and I'm going to do that by faith that Jesus, you are the King, you are the true, real human being, and you show us what it is to live.
Amazing. I mean, even though it's such a different style of literature, it's a letter and so on. I mean, it's a direct link with, for example, the Great Commission, isn't it? Like, teach them to obey everything I've commanded you, and this thing is going to go global. Yeah. So there's such a clear link with Jesus.
And I think that if you've grown up in church, or you've come into evangelical church or Pentecostal church, we've focused on the go and make disciples of all nations, or I have apostleship to call all the Gentiles, and we focus so much on that bit. It's all about get more people, and get them to pray this prayer. And once they've prayed this prayer, then what's the point? Like, they go to heaven maybe, but actually you've got to have both. Like, go get the people, but it's about obedience, it's about changing the way we live in this life to live right. Amazing. And then it carries on beyond death.
Amazing. Okay, so another question we're going to chuck up. What is salvation?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's linked. They're all linked, aren't they?
Yeah.
So Paul says this. This is verse 16 of chapter 1. Now, what you find actually in a lot of Paul's letters is he gives an intro which tells you everything he's going to say. Okay. And he does it in the first 17 verses of Romans. It basically tells you everything he's going to say for the next 16 chapters.
Okay.
So 1 to 17 is the intro. And at the end of the intro he says this: I'm not ashamed of the gospel, that's the message he's preaching, because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Now, I think most of us, if we've been around church for a while, would know that. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to bring salvation to anyone who believes. Yeah. The question is, what is salvation? Yeah. What is the power needed to do? Why is God's power required for salvation? We know His forgiveness is required for salvation, but what's the power doing there? In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. And then he quotes, as we've said, Habakkuk, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And so the power is power to enable people to live righteousness by faith. It's power. There's an empowering that comes to you. When you are saved, it enables you to treat your kids like you always should have treated them. It enables you to respond to your boss or your employer or the people who work for you as you always should have. It elevates the way that you can live to being right.
Amazing.
That's what it means.
Amazing. Yeah, because, touch upon again what you said. Many of us will have grown up with a salvation that only kind of frees us from the past, or the consequences of sin in the past, or the debt of sin in the past. Whereas there's such an emphasis in these chapters on freedom from the power of sin, and therefore freedom not to sin in the future. You can kind of use reigning in life language or things like that, and it's exactly what you're saying. Come at this again with the fundamental questions: what do we need, and what does God do? What else does it pull out for us about salvation?
So I think that this is the fundamental thing, is that what Paul looks at in these chapters is this is what it really means to be a saved people living now. This is what the requirement is. So you are forgiven. Your past is dealt with, but now your future becomes, actually you begin to live a new type of humanity. Now there's so many things we can get into in this. But fundamentally, he says, like, you used to live in the way of Adam. That was the way that humans lived, and that was a disempowered life, where you ended up doing things you didn't really want to do, even though you wanted to do the right thing, but then you ended up not doing the right thing, and it's like, oh, what a wicked man I am, and so who will save me from this body of death? Like that was the way it was. And then there's a new way to be human, a new way which is empowered. That now you no longer need to just do something that you don't really want to do. Now you no longer need to do the wrong thing even when you do the right thing. It's an empowered way of living. And the Spirit is the power that you have. So that's salvation. It's like you have now God's power living within you to enable you to live right.
Amazing. Okay, another question we're going to chuck up. What's God like?
What is God like? So he answers this question. It's chapter 2. chapter 2. This is what Paul says. Now, this is one of the reasons I think we find Romans hard. Am I right? There's a lot of talk about judgment and anger and wrath.
Yeah, I mean, emotion at an emotional level, like, ooh.
Is this the same God? Is this Jesus?
Yeah.
So this is a kind of example of a quote. You, because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. To those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honour and immortality, he will give life. But for those who are self-seeking, who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. Now, if you've grown up with a vision of salvation being, my sins in the past have been forgiven and now I can go to heaven when I die, you read this and you think, what? Why is God angry like this? Why is God wanting to put his wrath or his anger on? Why would he punish anybody? Like, can't he just forgive them? And so you kind of reading this and I just don't make sense. If you come with Paul's perspective, again, remember what Paul's perspective is of Eden. People were meant to live in Eden, do the right thing to care and steward over creation. They failed and they started to do things that they thought were right, or to fail to do what was right. And now God is restoring to people the ability to do things right. Think about if you were going to open a new orchestra, a venue, a music venue, and you wanted to get an orchestra to come and play them, and they'll be getting that, or the house band. Now what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, guys, here's a whole load of musicians, and you all have the ability to play really, really super well. I know you do. You're great musicians, and I'm going to actually, give of myself to you to train you and get you ready to be these great musicians. And when you are then in it, you're going to fill the room with music. It's going to be like the most wonderful venue. I'm going to be there. I'm going to love being in the venue. You're all going to love being in the venue. It's just going to be it's an amazing time. And that's a narrative. It's an understanding of narrative. And that's really what Paul says, and the Hebrew understanding of creation was. Like, God is the one who's recruiting people to play instruments in his creation, to steward over it, to rule over it. It'll be harmonious and beauty, shalom, and all this kind of stuff. And what happens is that some of the guys in the rehearsals start to refuse to to play the part that the music instructor, conductor, whoever, is telling them to play. And some of them actually deliberately then go around and start saying to other people, hey, don't play that. I've got a much better part. Now, if you look at it from that perspective, you think, when it comes to the day when the final selection of the orchestra is made, the day of God's wrath, the day of his decision, the day when the consequences of everything that's been done are fully presented to everybody, he may have sat there and allowed them to whisper in each other's ears and mess around in the things and not play the right stuff. But what Paul's saying is there's going to be a day where he no longer kind of sits back, and he's actually going to say on that day, right, do you know what? Tom, you refused. You've just refused to play what I'm asking you to play. So you get the consequences of that. You won't be in the band. You're not going to be in the house band. I can't have you in that place because you'll ruin it. And over. But those who have sought to do good, those who have sought glory and honour, you've done it. It was there, you went along with it, and now you're in the house band. And it's that narrative is super helpful for understanding God created the earth as a story, not as a one-off, not as a set of principles. And so the Day of Judgment, which is kind of fundamental to Romans. I don't know, do you remember there was an illustration that we were told, probably in youth group, about the Day of Judgment, which is what's going to happen is that you're going to sit on a sofa, a bit like this one, and a video player is going to start, and there's going to be streams of all of your life, and all you and all your friends are going to watch it. And I remember thinking, oh man, there's some things what can I do? Like, what can I do? What can I do about that? Some of those things I said about people or did, man. Now that is actually not a particularly biblical vision of the Day of Judgment. Okay. Because that presents the Day of Judgment as sort of retribution coming on you. Who do you think you are? Like, this shows everybody what you were like. The Day of Judgment is much more like the final episode of The Apprentice,
Okay.
where Sir Alan Sugar comes into the room and he's like, I've watched you over all this time and you're hired. You're hired. Like, you are the person I want to work with on this project, or I want to invest. I want to invest in what you want to do, Andy. I see the potential. I see you're the kind of person I want to work with. You're hired, and then it starts. That's when the real stuff begins after that moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what Paul's vision of salvation is, that and who God is. God has got an amazing future that's full of investigation and entrepreneurship and creativity and all kinds of incredible opportunities and freedom to do whatever you want to do. And so he wants to make sure that the people he entrusts with that freedom and that possibility are people who he can work with, and who want to work with him. And I think it's C.S. Lewis who said that the only people who won't be in heaven, heaven, which I wouldn't necessarily choose to use, but in the new creation, the only people who won't be there are those who wouldn't enjoy it. Because they're the ones who don't want to do what God says. They don't want to go along with what they've spent their whole life saying, no, God, I don't acknowledge you, and I want to say what's right, and I don't accept what you say is right, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? A couple of things that have helped me just kind of come at it from a kind of cultural angle, and as you're speaking there, I mean, it's fascinating to me that as a culture it's often portrayed that we hate judgment, but then we love shows like The Apprentice, or some of the biggest stars on entertainment shows are the judges. I mean, even in sports now, it's almost like the biggest star of the sports entertainment package are the pundits. And it's like, at some level, there's a deep hunger for somebody somewhere to state, this was good, this was not good, you're in, you're out. That's kind of a just fascinating aside for me. And the other one is that, our culture is often portrayed as struggling with judgment. But then there are many cultures in the earth that struggle with the forgiveness aspect. Like judgment, no problem. Yeah, of course, because these wicked invading armies absolutely pillaged us. Of course there should be judgment. What they struggle with is the forgiveness aspect. And so these texts, they challenge us, but it's also like, we're not the centre of the universe. Like and that's part of what we're pushing for when we're calling for these texts to form us.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that, and I think that's really interesting, isn't it? That when you're no longer having to worry, you're not having to fight yourself for your self-preservation. It's not on you and your wits and your thing to make sure your future's looked after. Then you're actually much more happy for there to be judgment, and you're much more happy to release forgiveness. Once you know that. Whereas if you think judgment's coming, and like the picture on the wall, and oh man, I don't like that God, because he's going to come. I don't like that vision of judgment. And equally, if me forgiving somebody means that they get off scot-free, and I don't want that. I want to hold something against them. But when you can actually be like, do you know what? God has called me. He's birthed me. Like, actually, there's a whole thing, an inheritance, like a new creation. I'm a co-heir with Christ. Like, there's just unparalleled opportunities and inheritance ahead of me. It's just a lot easier to say, okay, God, I trust you. That if there's things about me that you want to change, okay, change them. That's not going to affect my well-being in the long term. Actually, in fact, if anything, it's going to improve my well-being. So we love it. We love it.
So next question, I'm gonna chuck up in the light of those things. We've talked about the point of being a Christian. We looked at salvation, what God's like. How can I be a good Christian?
Yeah.
How can I do well?
Well, I mean, so we carry in this, like, the God is the God of love, and he's looking to recruit a people to be the rulers and co-rulers and co-heirs of his new creation when he brings it in after his day. So you become somebody who practices the ruling and stewarding and the doing things right now ahead of time. Like you rehearse your instrument, you practice your scales, you do the stuff.
You play.
And what Paul does in Romans kind of 6, 7 and 8, and then on a little bit more, but particularly because we're looking at these 6, 7, 8, is he then looks at ways, particular things that will make it hard to be a good Christian now. And the first thing that he looks at is that people will suggest to you, oh, well, if God loves you and you're part of new creation and you're forgiven, just go and sin, right? Why don't you just go and do whatever you want?
Yeah.
And Paul's like, this is a challenge you're going to face. And just remember, the better you get now at your instrument, the more glory and honour and the more fun it is. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Why, when if Jurgen Klopp knocked on this door and said, hey Tom, I want to recruit you into the Liverpool football team, who would go off and say, hey guys, I never need to play football again because I've now made you'd be like, wow, let me go and practice, let me go.
Yeah.
It just makes sense in every aspect of the world, and that's what he says in Romans chapter 6 effectively.
Yeah.
Like, you've got the dream calling, so enjoy it, get ready for it. And then in chapter 7 he talks about the challenge of dealing with the flesh, and that leads into chapter 8. And really what he compares is, if you live out of the old way of being that you had, you'll struggle. But if you live out the new way of being, which is out of the Spirit, then you'll know that the love of God will fill your heart. That's in chapter 5. But then in Romans chapter 8, the Abba Father, the Spirit will cry, Abba Father. He helps you in your weakness. So when you don't even know what to do or don't know what to pray, you don't end up doing the wrong thing because he helps you. Be attentive to the Spirit. Even when you suffer, suffering will come against you. Even then you can know, chapter 5 and chapter 8, suffering will do you good in all circumstances. Now God will bring you good. So it's just like this unparalleled thing that whatever comes at you now, if you lean into the Spirit, if you lean into faith in the grace of God and in what he's asking you to do, in every moment, nothing can in any way diminish what you have. And in fact, God will cause even the most grotesque and awful things to enhance what you carry within yourself.
Yeah, amazing.
And even death cannot take it away. Even death cannot. And we've, spent 2 years where the most, the final statistic that nobody can get past is death. Like how many people have died of COVID or whatever. And death is like the final statistic. From the perspective of so much of our culture, God's like, it's not even a statistic. Like, it's just, it's nothing.
No.
Not even death can separate you, because actually that just is the doorway through into the fullness of everything that he's beginning to create in you now.
Amazing. We're going to look at some implications of this to finish off, but there's one more question I want to sneak in, Tom, because I've heard you speak about it a bit. I think it'd be helpful. Why did Paul write this letter? And what kind of, it's obviously picking on some main points, but why did he write this letter to this church in this way at this time? And then maybe we'll finish off with some of the implications.
Yeah. Well, I can't claim to know every. Obviously, he did it for many reasons. But what he says in this letter is essentially this: in the old way of being human, Andy would be a Jewish guy who grew up carrying faith, and I was a Gentile, and these guys would have this, and there was a separation. Like, you kind of separated yourself by tribe. And what he sees happening in the church all over the Mediterranean is that people, when they've come to now be part of the new humanity in Christ, once they're now Christians, they continue to separate themselves from each other as if they were still like the old form of humanity. And he's like, this is just a denial of you now being new humans who together will co-rule over all of creation, over all the earth, in fact, all the universe. And so one of the key things that Paul does with all of his churches is he says, You Jews, you Gentiles, you must come together. You are one humanity. Break down the dividing wall of ethnic identities and become one in Jesus. And probably in Rome there was a little house who was Jewish people, another little house that was Jewish people, a group of Gentile people, and they wouldn't mix. They wouldn't do church together. And Paul basically says this just denies the gospel. You have to come together, love one another, because everything that we know about what doing right by God is to love one another. And you can't say no to that.
Yeah.
And as you do that, that will make you strong, it will strengthen me, and then you guys as a united, diverse church will send me to Spain, and then we'll go and see some more people come into the kingdom.
Amazing. So all of that we've looked at, what's the point of being a Christian? What's salvation? What God's like? How can you do well as a Christian? How can you be well as a Christian? I mean, all of that stands on itself, doesn't it? But it's the creation of, I'm struggling for language here, the creation of a new people, a forming of a new humanity. And let's get everyone in on this who calls on the name of the Lord.
And that's what we'll talk about next week, because that's 9 to 11 is a lot of him dealing with, hold on a minute, new humanity? What? I thought he loved the old humanity. Yeah. And that's what we'll talk about next week.
Brilliant. Just to finish off then, what implications would you particularly want to pull out from Romans 1 to 8? Little steps.
Yeah, well, I think holiness is a massive thing, isn't it? To actually say, do you know what, God, I will accept your definition of what is right, and I will seek to live that. And I see that as what is calling on me. That's what it's about, to be a Christian. I think there's not a lot more to be said on that, really, is there? Like, that is. The second thing, maybe a little bit more to be said, which is to actually really actively... do you have a plan to have a day fueled more by the Spirit? Like, do you have a plan to see the Spirit's power filling you and influencing you more and more throughout your day? Right? We talked last Sunday in the mornings about how just beginning each day to say, God, you love me, Father, you love me, and then to say, and then off the back of it, you can say, actually, come Holy Spirit, I want you to help me do this day. And little moments all through the day where something comes up and you think, okay, Spirit, help me. Which I think there's a bit more in that, isn't there? And the final third implication, which is that we are strange. The call of a Christian is to... The idea was that there would be humanity, and then God would make kind of this day where he'd be like, okay, done, and then the concert hall, whatever, the new creation would be open. There'd be a clear distinction. You can't see that very well because the things are clear, but that would be what happened. And so what he's... Let's turn that around so you can see that. Oh, there you go. So you've got a red thing in the middle and then white. And what effectively happens is that when Jesus comes, the white new creation people begin to live even in the midst of this existing creation. And that's why there's suffering, that's why there's sin, that's why there's challenge and persecution and disagreement and all that kind of stuff. Because God hasn't dealt with everything that's wrong yet. He hasn't got rid of it. He hasn't removed it. You're still doing it in the midst of that. And what he therefore says is that as a church, you will be strange in that you are people living the life as if everything in all creation is full of all that is good and right and true. But you're doing that in a creation that is not all that's good and right and true. It's fallen, it's got all these things going on. And so you will look different from the people around you. And things will happen to you that don't really make sense, but don't lose faith and continue to live as strange people.
Amazing. So sanctified, Spirit-filled and strange. There we go. I've got the 3 S's. I've been brought from confusion to clarity. Absolutely amazing. I mean, I think to circle back to where we started, just it makes me want to go back and just, listen to the whole thing as one again. Now with some of these ideas, or read through from beginning to end. I mean, that's how they would have heard it originally, isn't it? Somebody would have stood up in the church in Rome and read it out to, people all over the intellectual spectrum, all over the cultural spectrum. But here's it. You need it you get it. So we want to keep encouraging you to engage with this amazing book.